I really didn't like being in school, and I didn't like team sports, things like that. It's hard to believe that a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old can have pressures, but I felt whatever pressures there were, and I just would take off to the woods, and I found peace there. I felt that going to the woods relieved those pressures. And of course, nowadays, they talk about the value of being out in green environments, and what a fantastic way it is to slow you down, bring your blood pressure down, give you a chance to think, give you a chance to breathe, and it puts us back to our roots that we essentially evolved in as human beings.
Welcome to the Calgary Sessions. This is episode number 152. I'm your host, Jeff Humphreys. Before I get into it, if you like this show, subscribe to this damn show. I'm trying to get some more exposure around it, so I'd appreciate it. Today's guest, this was an intro done from our mutual friend, Mr. Laval St. Germain. I asked him, like, do you know this guy? And he's like, yep. And so he did the intro, and sure enough, you said yes to be on it. So please name and who you are.
I'm Brian Keating, and I've been living in Calgary since my high school years. I'm a naturalist. I used to work for the zoo, and now I lead trips to different parts of the world.
It's so funny because people, when I say your name,
yeah,
you've been around for a good amount of time.
I'm an old guy.
Well, but everyone knows the name, right? But I know the name, but what does he do? So as I've been telling people that you're coming on the show, and I'm trying to explain like who you are and what you do, so I'm like fumbling for my words. So it's good for me to hear how you explain who you are, so I can actually say the same thing to people, because you do a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I've been around for a long time, as you said, and I've had a radio show with CBC for forever, probably for closing in on 4 decades. So yeah, I'm turning 70 next year.
You are?
Yeah, so it's been a long time effort.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for being here. This is a cool one for me to get to. So the gist of the show, I like the guests to go back as far as they want to go. So how they grew up, where they grew up, parents, siblings, school, jobs, and we'll kind of weave our way to where you are today. So
cool.
Take this thing back as far as you want to go, and we'll just kind of start weaving our way through.
Well, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, where did I get this? Where did I start this interest in nature? And I have to say there was a turning point at age 12. When it all started. My brothers had set up a nature museum in the garage, and I thought it was not very good.
Where was this? Where were you born?
In New York. I was born in Medicine Hat, but we moved to Long Island because my sister was born deaf, profoundly deaf. Oh, nice. And my parents wanted her to be able to interact in the hearing world.
Well, so do you sign?
No, because the school that she went to was Lexington School for the Deaf. It was one of 2 schools in those days that taught deaf kids how to speak by lip reading.
So my grandma and grandpa are both deaf.
Wow.
So my mom and her sister are not deaf. My mom's parents were both deaf.
Interesting.
And yeah, so I grew up, and so they're both passed now. But yeah, I grew up around deaf grandma and grandpa, and it's a different experience
for sure. Yeah. They say it's the invisible handicap, because you can't tell if somebody's deaf until they start to talk. Yeah. But yeah, I just said goodbye to my sister this morning. She's heading back to Edmonton today. She was over. We had a little family gathering yesterday, and so deafness is what brought us to New York. And there was 2 opportunities for deaf schools. One was Lexington School for the Deaf in New York City, and the other was one down in Washington, D.C. And my parents didn't want to live in Washington, D.C. Long Island was only about an hour's drive or so from the city. So every Monday morning, Dad would get up at 5 a.m. and drive my sister to school in New York City, and then come back, and he'd go to work, and then he'd pick her up on Friday afternoon. So Nancy was home from age 3. She was basically at a boarding school until she went into a hearing school in about grade 5 or 6, I think.
This is fascinating to me, obviously. To make a decision to pick up a family to move.
I know. I know.
How does that?
From small town Medicine Hat.
Like, how is that even on the radar?
57 Chev, a homemade teardrop trailer on the chassis of a pickup truck, back end of a pickup truck. Homemade trailer. 4 kids under the age of 8, and they drove from Medicine Hat to New York. and we had some relatives on Long Island, and they put us up for our initial stay there until Dad found a house for us to buy. And I mean, it was a monumental decision.
Yeah.
And you know what parents do for their kids?
Yeah.
It's really quite astounding. And it stimulated an interest for my mother. She became a speech therapist. So she had done a college degree in nursing or in lab tech, and she obviously had the smarts to go on to university, but she went on to university and then eventually taught. And then when she moved back to Calgary, when we all moved back to Calgary when I was 17, so I came just the year before I turned 18, which would have meant I would have been eligible for the Vietnam draft. And in those days, I wasn't looking at going to university, which would have been a way to avoid the draft for a while.
Yeah.
So my parents decided it was time to come back home. Both my brothers left New York before they turned 18, so they could avoid the draft card. Because once you get a draft card, then the landed immigrants like us, we were picked first on the lottery system to go to fight in Vietnam. And my parents didn't want us to go into a war they didn't believe in.
Yep.
And so my two brothers left. Then I came back up here with my parents. But when I was 12 years old, I started this little nature museum, and that's what got me interested in bird watching. And my mother saw I was kind of a lost kid. I didn't like school. I sat in the schoolroom, always looking out the window at the forest that I was going to go explore. Fortunately, we lived next door to about 40 acres of woodlot, or within a 5-minute walk of 40 acres of woodlot. So that was my place where I went to play. Yeah. That's where I built forts and rode my bike on trails. And eventually that's where I started to birdwatch. And
no history, right? There's nobody in your nobody else in your family's like has this interest. It's just me. You found it. And
I found it. Mom and Dad, they had Dad's little silver teardrop tag along or trailer was eventually sold, and then he bought a nice trailer. So the way our family did things was to go off camping, and so that put me out in nature areas. Yeah. And then when I twigged onto this interest at age 12, Mom picked me up a secondhand pair of binoculars. They were a German made, probably acquired somewhere during World War II. And Mom bought them for $5 in a secondhand store, and they were great. And that's what it showed me, Jeff, was the twinkle in the eye of the robin on my front lawn. And suddenly nature became stunningly beautiful. And then I'd look at it on Audubon magazine, and I'd see these beautiful color pictures on the front. I thought, I want to do that. So I got my first single lens reflex camera shortly after I got my first pair of binoculars, and with a 200 millimeter lens. And I realized that there was a lot to this business of taking good photographs.
It's not just the tools.
It's not. You don't just take the picture. And my first picture of a cardinal, for instance, was a little red dot in the middle of the picture. So it took a while to work my way up, but I've been keenly interested in photography ever since. And when video started to become a relevant thing, and when video cameras became small enough to take out into the backcountry, that's when I started working extensively with video cameras. And but it was that initial pair of binoculars that slowed me down. And because I really didn't like being in school, and I didn't like team sports, things like that, I was into gymnastics, but that's very, very much an individual thing. I just would take off to the woods, and I found peace there. I found the pressures. It's hard to believe that a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old can have pressures, but I felt whatever pressures there were, and I felt that going to the woods relieved those pressures. And of course, nowadays, with books like The Nature Principle, written by Richard Louv, they talk about the value of being out in green environments, and what a fantastic way it is to slow you down, bring your blood pressure down, give you a chance to think, give you a chance to breathe, and it puts us back to our roots that we essentially evolved in as human beings.
Do you think? Two questions. I got lots, but the first two are like, why birds? And then the idea of like that pressure you felt, was it just because you were a little bit different? School, sports, like it's just.
Yeah, I didn't like school. Yeah. I didn't think I was smart. And, the way it started, actually, it was interesting. I was put in a kindergarten that played with Play-Doh in Levittown on Long Island before we moved into our house in Oyster Bay. And so when I moved to the house in Oyster Bay a year later, I was put into grade 1 because I had finished kindergarten. But the kindergartners in that particular school that I moved into had learned how to count by the time they hit grade 1. I didn't have a clue. I could do really good with Play-Doh. And so right away I was labeled as a slow kid.
Right.
And, and that's, I mean, I don't blame the teachers or anybody for that. It's just the way it was. And mom and dad were, obviously they had this little deaf child that they were trying to get up and running. And so I was sort of the one that was left in the dirt, but that's okay. I found the forest. And that has given me, and you asked about birds, birds were accessible. It's hard to find a deer or a bear or a raccoon to watch, but it's easy to find a bird there in your backyard. So I set up bird feeders. I had bird feeders all over the place. I put a little shelf feeder in front of my bedroom window so I could lie in bed in the morning and watch birds just a meter or two away. And it just gave me such a deep appreciation. And the more I got into birds, the more that allowed me the opportunity or the excuse to go and explore other areas. So my buddy and I would hop on our bikes with our binoculars and we would go exploring different places on Long Island, sometimes biking ridiculous distances away. But in those days, we were free range kids.
Which is, I grew up in the 80s and I go out the front door and just get my bike, go in the ravines, go wherever I kind of wanted, just make sure you come home for dinner. So
that's right.
It was very basic and simple.
That's right.
I'm sure you had a longer leash than I did. Like it was just go wherever you want.
Yeah. Oh, it was great. And bikes would take me anywhere. So, and then of course, when we got older, my buddy got a motorcycle. So he even got us further and on and on it went. But the joy of exploring different habitats. And then I remember one day, Jeff, like it was yesterday, and I must have only been, I probably was 13. I was walking through the woods by myself. I had a garbage can lid on my head because it was pouring rain. It was one of those East Coast miserable, low cloud, ugly days. And I was cutting through the woods, and I came around a corner, and here was this summer tanager, this unbelievably brilliant bird that's a migrant from Central and South America. And there it was, hardly a meter in front of me, maybe 2 meters in front of me, but it looked like it was lit with day glow paint. And I'll never forget that moment. And I just stood, and this bird sat quietly looking at me, and I went straight home and started my life list. And then once I started a list, and then I started to count these birds and started to write them down, it didn't become a ridiculous passion and focus. I still went to see the beauty, and I didn't care if I saw the same bird 5 times. So it wasn't just the list, like many birders are accused of doing. It was the joy of going out and discovering beauty and giving me a chance to slow down and clear my head. And and that graduated when I came back to Canada at age 17. The first thing I wanted to do was start backpacking. I used to see these long lens pictures of the Calgary Tower with the mountains in the background. You know how that compresses it? And I couldn't wait to get out into those mountains. And then, for the next several decades, that was my focus.
When you see these birds at a young age, how did you then do the research to figure out what these birds were?
I got a golden guide to the birds of North America. And I remember I was sitting on this little steep trail in the woods, hardly 5 minutes away from my house. And I was looking at some warblers with my binoculars, and I figured out the bay-breasted warbler. And to this day, I can remember the satisfaction of working that species out. And of course, warblers they're a kaleidoscope of bird. They're just they are the, how tropical fish are so unbelievably diverse and colorful. Warblers are the equivalent. And to figure out one of the warblers on my own sitting in the woods, it was very powerful. And that's a very satisfying experience when you're a little kid. And I did it through paging through my book. And I remember when we'd be driving, up to our camping spots in upstate New York or Vermont or up to Maine, I remember sitting in the back of the car just paging through the bird book and memorizing birds. and looking at birds that I wanted to see. And so, yeah, that was, and then when I came to Calgary, I joined the Calgary Field Naturalists, as they called them in those days. It's called Nature Calgary now. And there was one other young fellow that was in that group, and we formed the Young Naturalists group.
Amazing.
Two of us.
Was it hard to find that group? Like when you got to town, was it hard to find like-minded people? And I was, as you're talking about like cruising, going camping, and you're reading through this book, what'd your parents think? Like it's wildly different, right? To have that kind of passion and energy around this.
I think they were happy that I was just finding something that entertained me.
No more Play-Doh. You're actually like,
well, and no more, I mean, when you sort of feel rejected, it's kind of nice to see your kid, I think, do something that interests them. And I don't think I ever felt rejected as such. It's just that I had a different way of looking at things, I suppose. But no, it was it just gave me something to focus on and something to do.
Yeah,
what a pleasure.
And so get to Calgary, 17.
Yeah.
You find this group. Was it?
It was easy. Calgary Field Naturalists. They were, advertising walks and talks. And of course, I was interested in finding out what birds were around Alberta.
Yep.
I mean, magpies to me were now incredibly cool and different. So when you're a newcomer to a place like this, it's a whole slate of opportunities. And I had no car license or a car. I was 17. And so,
or did the family come with, or you came?
Yeah, no, my family came with. My brothers came before, and they went to University of Calgary and to SAIT. But so I joined the Calgary Field Naturalists. That gave me access to field trips. And so I would go in the back seat of cars of other keeners. They were most of them were older than me, but I didn't care. And it got me to southern Alberta, into coulees, into river valleys. We did canoe trips, and it just opened up the world. And then in high school was kind of frustrating because some guy found out I was a bird watcher, and so I was called Birdman for the rest of my high school years.
It's so ridiculous, right?
And so, but when I got to university, everybody at college first, and then university after that, there was people with the same interests as me. And so I was amongst my peers, and everything just took off from there, and the sky became the limit. And it's funny, I never really planned out any objective. It's just that I saw cool opportunities come up and I grabbed them.
Coming out of high school, did you have an idea, like college and then university? Did you have a plan or
not really. I didn't think I was smart enough to go to university. So I was actually working as a machinist because I took machine shop in high school. I liked working with my hands. It was that Play-Doh thing, I guess. And so I thought I would do that. But, I was working midnight shift at Barber Industries on McLeod Trail in Calgary and turning steel, which was cool. But
hard.
Yeah, hard. And I found myself hiking every weekend and, doing canoe trips and hiking trips, and I started to climb mountains at that point. And I thought, no, I want to do something with my life that allows me to do this as part of my career.
That's a big decision to come to too, right? To actually, and kind of vague though too, right? Like
I didn't really know how to do it.
Yeah.
But I went to college. Then I got a job as a naturalist with the Canadian Wildlife Service down in southern BC. So holy cow, now actually the first job I got was in southern Saskatchewan, in southern BC, and then I went to southern Saskatchewan, and it was fantastic because suddenly now I'm being paid to learn about the wildlife of that area and then talk to people about it, and so so it taught me a couple of valuable skills. One was communication, and the other was the value of getting knowledgeable about certain subjects.
Was that summertime job, full-time job?
Summertime.
Yeah.
And then I got a full-time job with the Canadian Wildlife Service as the assistant manager of the Prairie Wildlife Center, just 18K this side of Swift Current.
And no school then? So you're just kind of like...
That was after I finished my university. So in between, I was doing, the first year at college, a friend of mine had worked up in the Arctic and as a weather tech, but they had positions as handymen, which required no skill except being able to learn how to polish the floor, wash the dishes, and scrub the urinals, which is what I did for a summer up there.
Handy.
For 4 months. Not necessarily in that order, but but the joy of that job. I mean, I was 3,500 kilometers north of my parents, and 1,000 kilometers south of the North Pole. I mean, we're talking serious Canadian wilderness, and that's where I developed my passion of this treeless landscape. Hence the alpine environments, and for the last few decades, Antarctic and so on. But that Arctic experience at a young age of 21, that was a fantastic investment of time, and it got me away from the frustrations of school and work, all the things that sort of bog us down. It got me away from girls, all the things that are challenging at that age, and I just focused on hiking. That was my preoccupation that summer. And 24-hour light, 21 years of age, and there was testosterone squirting out of my ears, so lots of energy to go and play. And that's what, and fortunately I worked with a fellow who we've kept in touch with ever since, and he got into the environmental world too, a fellow from Winnipeg. He and I just would push each other. And so we ended up doing mega hikes to long distances. And we had encounters with Peary's caribou, which are, Canada's own Arctic caribou. We encountered Arctic fox. Arctic wolves were a near, every long hike we did, we encountered Arctic wolves. We had incredible experiences with muskox. There was a Newfoundlander that lived, there was only 8 or 10 of us at the weather station. One of them was a Newfoundlander. He built a boat because they're genetically programmed to build boats. His name was Leonard, and Leonard built a 12-foot dinghy, and it looked just like a dory that you would see tied up on the dock in Newfoundland. Amazing. And he painted it international orange after the John A. Macdonald, and we called this boat the John B. Macdonald. And the John A. Macdonald was the icebreaker for Canada in those days that would carve ice through so that a barge or a tanker could bring fuel and supplies to the weather stations after the ice would go in late August. And so when the John B. A. Macdonald came up, we took the John B. and went around and around and around and around the John A. until the captain came out and invited us aboard.
Now?
And then I told the captain, he said that he wanted a set of muskox horns. And in those days, you took stuff like that. Nowadays, I come across stuff like that in the wild, I leave it. Yeah. But in those days, nobody thought twice about it. And the captain said that he wanted a set of muskox horns. And I said, well, I was hiking over on the other side of the peninsula because the John B. Macdonald would allow us to get over to that side. And we did a 2-day hike there. And I found a beautiful skeleton of a muskox with a big male with a beautiful boss and nice horns. And he said, well, let's go in the helicopter. So we did. And we landed the helicopter beside. I spotted the skeleton from a long ways away because I knew exactly where it was. And we landed the helicopter beside it. We got out. He had one of those double axe, it's for emergencies with the helicopter. Took out the axe because there was still connective tissue holding the vertebrae onto the skull. Pulled it off, and I have this vision in my mind of him holding that skull above his head. But it got us a helicopter ride, and it just shows you open your mind to these opportunities, and it's really quite astounding. And the reason why we crossed that fjord in the first place is because a Canadian Wildlife Service biologist had set up a blind at a gyrfalcon lair, a nest. And I wanted to go and see. I wanted to see a gyrfalcon, and I knew that there was a nest there because they use them, year after year, decade, generation after generation. They'll use the same nesting site, and so I suspected it would probably still be there. And so we hiked to that location. We never found the nest because we miscalculated or we were given the wrong information on which lake he was camped beside. But we still did this incredible hike to this incredible landscape that hardly anybody ever goes to, and that summer up in the Arctic really, I guess, set an imprint in my head to look for other opportunities like that.
I find it all fascinating, just because it's such a different approach. There's not a lot of people doing it.
Yeah.
It's this example is so far away. Everything's very remote, and you're kind of isolated. Do you just trust that it's the right thing to do? Are you just looking for experiences and you actually don't know what you're putting together or where it's going to go? Are you just trusting it?
Well, everything's sort of a calculated risk. You always leave a door open in the back. So you don't box yourself into an issue that's going to cause real problems. you know, what my brother said once when he was being interviewed about me with another fellow writing an article. And my brother's an accountant, great guy.
Yep.
But my brother said, I'm a bit of a risk taker. And I don't think I am. I think driving the Deerfoot Trail is a risk taker. So, you know, it's we every day we get into our cars and we go driving, and that's the most dangerous thing we do. Driving to the mountains to go and climb a mountain, the most dangerous part of that trip is the drive to the mountains. Yeah. And so I think the world is actually quite a friendly place. And if you go with the right gear in these wilderness areas, you go with the right gear and with the right experience, you can't do it without that experience. And I started backpacking in high school. And so, you know, over the years, I've made some mistakes. And in those early years, I put a lot on the line to get to the summit. I don't do that anymore. Yeah. You know, I've matured, I like to think. And although my wife sometimes argues that.
Some other people might question that.
And, you know, I have to say, too, that talking about my wife, I was lucky that at a young age I met a woman who was interested in the same things as me. And she and I have been partners throughout this whole effort. I didn't know her when I went to the Arctic that time, but I met her the following year when I worked as a naturalist in southern BC. And we had our desks were beside each other, and she was really good with flowers. I was really good with birds. So I made every effort possible to get her into the woods as often as I could.
Totally.
And eventually it worked. And I
just have to circle it.
Yeah, that's right. Our first date was a weekend backpacking trip, and way up into the high mountains of the Selkirks, and you know, and we haven't looked back since. And we've been sharing these adventures nonstop together.
To do it at like the volume you do it and the duration of time, is that the only way to make it work? Is to have somebody with you that actually...
Well, I think it's just nice to have somebody you can share these experiences with. And I just lucked out finding the right individual. And she became a medical doctor, and then she trained her patients to deal with the fact that she was going to be gone for these extended periods of time every year. And if they didn't like it, they could move on. But, you know, and then in between, we were the classic weekend warriors, Jeff. I mean, you know, when she was going to medical school, I'd pick her up at the university at 5 o'clock on Friday, and we would drive out to the mountains and we would hike until we were hiking with our headlamps on to get us into a good area so we could have a good weekend. And then, you know, so, and we made that arrangement every second weekend. She was mine. And in between, she was, you know, she would work on her studies. And we just carried that behavior in our workaday world. We would do these weekend expeditions, and it just gave us, you know, whatever might have been bothering me on Friday with whatever issues I was having in my own workaday world, they were dissipated and gone by Sunday night when we'd get home. You know, when you work your body and you're pumping blood, oxygenated blood through your system on a 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hour hike up a steep mountain, it clears your head.
Did you always know that? Like, did you always know that it was that when you were moving, doing these hikes, did you always know that it was kind of like this mental fitness exercise too?
It took a while to figure it out. You know, for a long, long time, Jeff, I was focused on the summit. And finally, there was a switch somewhere, maybe a decade into it, maybe in my late 20s or early 30s, probably my early 30s, this sort of flip where I realized the journey was the joy. It wasn't really necessarily the destination. And my idea of a good trip isn't necessarily the end point. It's the loop. You know, I love a loop trip, or where you can change the loop to go longer or further or shorter, depending upon how you're feeling. And it's that's a fun way to do it. And then, of course, when I started working at the zoo, I realized that there was an opportunity to be able to extend the boundaries of the zoo. The zoo is a fantastic place to get people into a place where you can begin to give them an understanding of the importance of intact ecosystems. The zoo is sort of like a picture frame of beauty that gives people a chance to fixate on something, but the real story is the importance of intact nature. Because without intact ecosystems as a species, we're doomed. And so we need to figure out ways to treat this world properly. And so in those early years, I started running trips out to the mountains to go and look in the winter at at tracks of animals, or in the summer, I latched onto these alpine lodges. There was 3 or 4 that I used, and like Assiniboine Lodge, for instance, they needed people coming, and I was a conduit to that. And so I would bring a group in for 3 or 4 days midweek or something like that. And then Mistaya Lodge up in the Rocky Mountains in the BC side. I had a relationship with Mistaya Lodge for at least 10 or 12 years where I'd bring a group in every year, and I never got paid for it, but they gave me a free weekend of skiing in the winter. So of course I would do it. Yeah.
How did you went from BC to Saskatchewan for those jobs and then to the zoo?
Yeah, that's right. I was in BC first for a number of years, at least 3 seasons. And that's where I finished off my college and then started university. Taking environmental science.
Okay.
Brandon University.
So you were, by that time, you'd kind of figured out that was going to be...
Well, once I got to college, I realized that if you applied yourself, you could actually do okay on the exams.
but you had to be interested in the thing, right?
Exactly.
I went to MRU 3 times and dropped out 3 times.
Wow.
Because I couldn't
find that niche.
That's it.
Yeah, of course.
So you're kind of lucky to, you do find it. It's like, oh.
Yeah.
Then you can, like, to your point, you can give it everything and it works.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that first season, that first year at college, I mean, I was partying with the rest of them. But then I went to that summer up in the Arctic. And I think that was the summer that I grew up. That's when I realized that, the joy of putting in effort and energy to explore and play around. I had a plant press with me up there, and I carried that everywhere I went. And then I had a key to the plants up there, so I was able to get them to species up there. But then when I came back to university in Manitoba, my botany instructor was great, and he allowed me to use the lab to mount all my plants. I still have that plant collection. And so I learned the Latin names of those plants before I knew their common names. And with many of them, I can still remember the Latin names to this day. But I just discovered the joy of that type of exploration. And so university, I found, straightforward. I still had to do the work, but as long as I did the work and studied, I figured out that if I treated it like a job, I would actually do okay on my marks.
And having like a group of like-minded people around you?
Yeah.
Does that just like fill you up to?
Absolutely. And I would search those out. I remember there was one guy at one of the floor parties in university, and he was wearing a buckskin jacket with frills on it and moccasins. And I thought, I got to talk to this guy. His name is Paul Novechnoff. We've been good friends ever since. And he said, the first thing he said to me when I got into a bit of a discussion, he said, I believe that a day of fishing is a day not off your life. And sure enough, his dad owned a fishing lodge in northern Manitoba, where I've been to since, and fished pike with him and pickled the pike. And Paul was quite a guy, just a classic northern Canadian. And he still is. He still owns the lodge. He's still working hard. We still keep in touch. And it's meeting those kinds of like-minded people that, definitely. And we did a lot of skiing. I did a lot more nighttime skiing at university than I did during the day, because during the day I was at school or studying. I found that I lived in a house with 7 or 8 other university students in one of those big Brandon homes that we rented together. And we would all end up at 2 o'clock in the morning having insomniac parties. So we started skiing after the library would close at 10 o'clock at night. We would all rendezvous at home. We would put on our ski gear, and we only had to go about a block before we got onto a trail in the river system. And we would ski at night until about midnight, and then we'd sleep like babies until the next morning. And so that's where I got into winter camping as well. And you got to be good at winter camping when you're camping in Manitoba, because it gets to about -1 million, all of it.
Were you always just up for the adventure? And you were talking about risk and that stuff. Like, when you're doing all these things, were you somewhat strategic of how it was going to work and planning it out and being thorough, or were you young enough that you were just like letting it rip?
To a large degree, I let it rip. but I still evolved.
Yeah.
And got better at what I did. And so, I remember the very satisfied feeling of being backcountry up on the Robertson Glacier, actually on the high call. So the Hague Glacier was just to the south. We had just ascended up that steep ridge and where you have to take your skis off, kick step up from the Hague ice field. And then I was standing on the ridge and the sun was going down. It was a red sky and I had to get back to the car. And I remember standing up there feeling so good, knowing that I could do it and that it wasn't a risk. I mean, I'd get back to the car when it was dark, but, all the difficult parts I'd be able to do in the light. And what a pleasure to have that kind of skill set, to be able to be out there with your partner or a couple of good friends and skiing that kind of environment. It's magic. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of the things you've seen, I'm sure it's just, my life isn't like that. So like, it's interesting how listening to these stories of what you've actually, because I'm having my own pictures of like what you've actually seen, which is.
Part of it was I got these, when Kananaskis first became a park, Peter Lougheed Park, they came up with all these maps. And so we got all those topographical maps and we pieced them all together on a big wall in the basement. And then with the yellow marker, we would outline the trails and the routes that we had done. And so when you look at it, all of a sudden it starts turning into this mass of yellow lines, but then you see where you've missed. And so we started coming up with some incredible trips, just bushwhacking, using trails to access, but then leaving the trail and bushwhacking and doing some remarkable trips. And you'd come up to a high call and we would always do the last 50 meters or so in silence so that when we got to the call, we would look over with binoculars. Binoculars, most important tool I own. My wife and I both have our own pair. We carry them in leather pouches on our belts. And we would get to the top of the call very quietly and look with binoculars. And once in a while, you get rewarded with an amazing sighting of goat or bighorn sheep, or if you're lucky, a grizzly bear. And we've had some fabulous experiences just watching these creatures. One time we got up to a high call called Warspit Call, and it's up behind a place called Black Prince Lake in Kananaskis, and we kick-stepped all the way up in the spring on styrofoam snow, the best kind of snow you can climb. And we got to the top, and we took our packs off. We were very quiet because you just never know what you're going to see up there. And we heard some rocks falling way above us. And so we just lay down on our bellies. Once we realized they were goats, we lay down on our bellies and watched, using our elbows as tripods. We watched these goats maneuvering along, and they hadn't seen us at that point. And then they came lower and lower and lower. Finally, one goat looked over at us, and my wife and I stayed absolutely still. It then got curious and it down climbed, and we could hear it below us on the cliffs below us, and we could hear it maneuvering around. And I knew it was just over that cliff. And this is in the days of Kodachrome film and manual focus. And I slowly stood up with the camera all set and ready to go. And in my viewfinder came this full face of this mountain goat in a 200 millimeter lens, which is not strong, about a full face of the goat with his eyes twinkling and his incredibly sharp horns. And he looked up at me and I went click, and he looked away. And then I cocked the camera and he looked back at me. I went click again, and he jumped off the back and then trotted over towards his buddies. And he wasn't panicked because he came to us. We didn't approach him. He wasn't panicked. He was calm, cool, and collected. And he then grazed with his 5 or 6 buddies, and for the next hour and a half or so, they slowly moved away. But to this day, that remains one of my most powerful mountain goat experiences. And it was because the goat approached us, and it was because of our careful, silent observation. And I think those are the types of experiences. That silence can get you into trouble too. We've done some pretty serious solo trips in Africa, and once we had our canoe bitten by a hippo, and it was because we were being quiet. If we had been talking, perhaps the hippo would have picked up on our vocalizations. And then I think what happened, we scared the hippo when we went over top of him, and he just looked up and saw this big monster above him, and then just chomped it. Yeah.
Wild, obviously. Those last 50 meters when you're walking up, in that silence, what does that actually feel like? Is your body like tingling? Do you know what's about to happen? Because it feels like a damn near spiritual event when you're like approaching that thing.
Yeah, well, boy, Jeff, good for you. Yeah, I think it is in a way, and my wife and I realized long ago that it isn't a competition. And if she's ahead of me, she'll wait for me. If I'm ahead of her, I'll wait for her for the last 5 meters, so, just in case. Because I mean, what a drag to get to the top and say, "I just saw a grizzly bear. Too bad you missed it." So yeah, we share those moments, and it's very, very special. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. It's like getting to the summit of a mountain too with good friends. You know, we have a little ritual. We pull out chocolate-covered coffee beans because it's kind of hard to brew a cup of coffee up there. So we have a little ritual where we pull out the coffee beans and tap them together. And
amazing. But it feels like that kind of environment.
Well, it's a celebration out there, and what an incredible place we live.
Yeah.
Western Canada, you know, I know the city's getting busier and bigger, and it's all the more reason to go out and play. And in this gift that we've been given called the Rocky Mountains, and further beyond too. During COVID, my wife and I, we bought a camper a number of years ago, a slide-on camper for our truck, little camper on a little truck, a very simple camper, and we thought we'd buy it for when we get really old. It became our go-to place during COVID, and we explored places in Saskatchewan that I haven't been to for decades. Our objective was just to keep going to protected areas and parks that we had never seen before, and it's amazing what we've got in this Western Canadian backyard.
So cool. Do you still have that picture of that goat?
Oh yeah. I have a slideshow that I do actually for it's called Rocky Mountain. It's called Rocky Mountain High, and it's or Mountain High Life, and it's a show that I've done for a long, long time, and I keep upgrading it because new stories appear. But it's basically the story of my love affair with my wife and my mountains, and that picture figures prominently, and when I show it, the audience always gasps. I mean, it's that good.
Is it blown up in your house somewhere? Like, is it actually?
I never did blow that one up. I have blown up quite a few, but not that one. But it features.
Sounds spectacular.
Yeah, it's a cool shot.
So, university. Do you know what you're going to do when you come out of it? Like, did you have a path or a plan?
Well, by then I had started working with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and it was actually my former boss at the British Columbia wildlife facility that I was working at that said to me one day, you know, Brian, if you want to get a full-time job with the Canadian Wildlife Service, you're going to need a university degree. So, and it happened, the same guy that told me about that opportunity to work at a weather station as a handyman, he and I were still good friends. We kept in touch in those days, and he had been going to Brandon University, and he said it's a small university, the classes are small. And so it's not like U of C or U of A or you know, any of these bigger universities, and also it was a ways away from home, and I liked exploring new places, so there it was. And so I didn't really know what I was going to do, but by then I had already started working with the Wildlife Service, so I thought maybe there was a career path there. But then my wife got into medical school in Calgary. I was in Saskatchewan, and I was riding my motorcycle in those days every week out to see her. And long distance relationships are good for a while, but then they dissolve. And I knew that, so I had to get to Calgary. And then an opportunity came up to take over the director of the education department for Calgary Zoo, and so I did that for the next 15 years, and then evolved into the director of conservation outreach for the 15 years following that.
So the Calgary Zoo job, in the industry or in that kind of world, is that a proud moment to get that job? Like, is that a moment where you're like, not that I've arrived, but I'm actually I'm in this world that I'm super passionate about?
I didn't really have much use for zoos in those days. I thought they were just places where cages and animals. I had no idea that they were doing all kinds of other international work. At least the progressive zoos were. Now, the Calgary Zoo wasn't in that position when I first started working there. But eventually, 15 years in, that's when I got the position of conservation outreach. So basically, my job then became to raise money and spend it on conservation projects around the world. So suddenly, there was deep meaning to what I was doing. Prior to that, I was in the education department. And you know, Jeff, there's a lot of people out there that don't really understand the significance and importance of intact ecosystems. I call it the great unwashed. They're really dirty. They don't get it. And the zoo opens its doors for everyone. And it gave me an opportunity to tell cool stories about the wildlife that we share this planet with. And it opened up the doors for me to learn about international species like tigers and elephants, and on it goes. And then it gave me some purpose to go and search for those creatures. So, since then I've been to India to look for tigers, and to Borneo to look for orangutans, and Africa with gorillas, and the list goes on and on. I mean, it gave me a global scope. So instead of Western Canada, now it became global. And that's what the zoo did. And then, of course, from a philosophical perspective, if the zoo is just showing animals, that's not fair.
Yeah.
They've got to do something bigger. And I became acutely aware of that as time went on. And one morning I woke up and I just felt I was tired of the position I was in at the zoo. And I went to my boss and said, I've always promised myself I would never work in a job just for the sake of the job. And I would like to do something that would work more on a conservation agenda. And he said, well, Brian, progressive zoos around the world are starting to develop conservation outreach programs. So I started that, and I did that then for the next 15 years.
Amazing.
But since I've left the zoo, that conservation outreach has grown hugely. So, it was good that somebody else came in and took my position, and they took it to the next level.
You talked about earlier about those out trips you did when you were with the zoo.
Yeah.
Did that feel like a thing right away? Like you kind of hosting events and kind of showcasing people and bringing people out to these different areas?
From a selfish perspective, Jeff.
Where you get these free trips.
Excuse me. Yes, it was a ball, and I loved it. And I loved taking groups out there. But it also developed a bit of a following and allowed me to evolve to the next level, which was to do these international trips. And then when I started working as the director of conservation, I would take the profits that I made from all of that and put it into the conservation fund. Right. And of the conservation fund, out of a unit of money that I would make every year, the next year I would spend 2/3 of it and put 1/3 of it in the bank as an endowment fund. And that endowment fund today has grown to $6 million. And it's still functioning and growing and providing money to conservation projects in different parts of the world, which gives me great satisfaction. Yeah. But during that time, it gave me the excuse to run these trips because I would make money for the conservation fund. And also, a lot of these people that we were running these trips with became very embedded in the zoo. Yeah. And they started to fund significant projects at the zoo. So it gave me a big jolt, no question, but it also was beneficial to the zoo. And that was clearly obvious as time went on. So once I left the zoo, of course, I just kept doing the trips.
When you say it wasn't like clearly, it wasn't obvious of what it was going to create.
Yeah.
What puts you on that path to do something like that, where you're like, I'm sure it felt right.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of reasons. Then it turns into this beautiful big picture. Like, how do you trust that decision?
Jeff, there's no magic formula. It's just gut.
Yeah.
I've always had this drive. And it just comes from the gut. I don't know, and usually it works because you make it work, So I think the successes that you get, the first, I started bringing in my childhood heroes to speak at the Jubilee Auditorium.
Half selfish, right?
Yes.
But fit.
Bingo. Yeah. And hugely successful. By then, I had done a lot of evening adult programs at the zoo, where I'd bring in biologists. So we would have a pianist who would play during dinner. We'd have the zoo prepare the meal. People would then be served, or we'd have buffet style in the early days. And we called it Where the Elite Eat. And it was 100 people. And I'd run them on a Wednesday night because I didn't want to screw up my weekend. So everything I did was during the week. And
you would host these? Like you would
I would host them,
see it, introduce people, and just kind of like, were you always comfortable in that spot?
It always gave me I would never say that I've been relaxed in front of a group of people, but I think once you are relaxed, then you may as well quit the business. You need that energy. I remember one of my college professors was a fellow by the name of Bob Sanford, who is very well known. He's in Canmore. He's one of the chairman of the IUCN. He's the water specialist group. So he's got an amazing position. But in those days, he was my instructor. Clearly a purely energetic athletic guy.
Yeah.
And he told me that he would actually get physically sick before he'd go up to the mic. So basically, he was fantastic in front of groups, still is. I hear Bob on the radio quite often talking about water issues. So he's grown into quite a huge position. But he was the guy that got me on this road to realizing that maybe I could make a living being involved in nature. So he was the first guy that did it. He wrote my first letter of recommendation to the Canadian Wildlife Service when I had an interview to work at the Creston Wildlife Center. So, you know, these people you meet early in your life set a direction. And Bob was the one that told me it's okay to be nervous before you get up in front of the group. But I find now, I've done it so often, I still have that nervous feeling when I get up there. But when I get involved and it starts to click, it just feels great.
Yeah, it's like you're natural.
Yeah.
And also talking about things that you're obviously super passionate about and knowledgeable about.
It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you start doing these trips, obviously they're amazing. I love the Wednesday night thing, not to mess up the weekend. But when you decide you're doing the trips, you know, that's growing into something fairly substantial at the zoo and this new position, what is the outlook like? What is the transition when you decide that that's like what's next?
Oh, yeah. Interesting question. I actually had quite a few people involved in running these trips with me. So that because I couldn't do them all and they became so popular. So I would interview other members of the zoo, and the ones that had a naturalist bent would be the ones that would be asked to lead trips. Yep. And so there was a core of 3 or 4 people that helped me out in that. So there was a way of carrying that on once I left. But I think, you know, you run your distance within a certain organization, and then it's time to leave. And you just know it. You know, at least I did. And I think, well, my wife said that one of her doctor mentors said to her that you really want to quit being a doctor before people would wish you would quit. And so there's some value to that. And by the time I decided to exit the zoo at age 55, I had already built an opportunity for myself just to continue on so I could keep making a living. And that's running these trips and also doing public speaking. So I developed quite a system of presentations when I was working at the zoo, and all the money I made from that went right into the conservation fund and to the endowment fund. And that's helped to build it to what it is today. And now the money that I make goes into the Brian Keating Retirement Fund, which I think is fair.
Agreed. When you get out at 55, was it like did it take you a while to figure out that you were done? You know, was it a year process to figure out that it was time to go? Like,
yeah, it was actually. I actually made a deal with the zoo that the zoo wouldn't have to pay me anymore, but I would still use the zoo as my office, and I would still book my presentations and my trips through the zoo with the zoo umbrella, but they would get a percentage of the proceeds of whatever I made. So whatever was left over was my income.
Gotcha.
And that lasted about a year, and then I just. That was the end of it. I mean, it just made sense to leave at that point. Well, I guess I needed a time to prove to myself that I could do it.
Good segue. Did you know that over all these years you were kind of building a brand? You know, like Brian Keating was becoming this thing beside this organization. Did you? And when you decided you were done at 55 to start something new is you know, it's not a risk, but it's
kind of weird.
It's different, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people want to shut it down at 55, 60, but did you realize that you had this kind of, that your name had some value to it and you could continue to do the thing?
I did, you know, but it's funny, Jeff, you know, I don't go out looking for this kind of, you know, attention or publicity or prestige or fame. But I use it as a tool. And, but I don't necessarily like it. You know what I like? I like going out there with my wife and camping. I like hiking. I like setting up the tent with a good view. I like being beside a river and hearing loons. That's what I like doing. But all the other stuff, I just have this gut need to keep doing. And so I'll do it until I don't like doing it anymore. So, and I don't know when that's coming yet. I mean, but for now, it's still fun. But I like, you know, what we do now when I run a trip, we'll stay afterwards. I'm doing 2 trips to the Galapagos and I've got 2 back-to-back trips back to the Galapagos Islands in a month from now. And then after that's over, after I say goodbye to the groups, my wife and I are heading down to the mountains in southern Ecuador where we'll spend 3 weeks hiking.
Amazing.
And so we like to add that on.
Yeah.
We just did a trip we took a group to Kenya in September. It was just an outrageously good trip with amazing experiences, amazing group of people, so into it, so involved. And I just love that. And, but then at the end, you're kind of spent.
Yeah.
And my wife and I went off, there's a cloud forest we had never been to in Kenya. It's actually Kenya's only cloud forest. And we went and rented a place there for a week and just explored and looked for primates and birds and did some really good hiking. And that's what we like to do now.
Yeah.
We like to add on extra time at the end of each one of these trips to go and play. I mean, we've done that forever with our trips down to the Antarctic. We've been exploring systematically Chile and Argentina. We love Patagonia. These are incredibly beautiful mountainous landscapes and offer a lot for anybody who's interested in outdoor adventure. We were in the Antarctic earlier this year, and at the end of that trip, my wife and I went to southern Chile and rented a log cabin in the woods for a week. We had our own fireplace, and there were some national parks that nobody had ever heard of, which is the kind of national park I like, and only the locals go there, and that's where we explored for the week that we were there, and what an incredible opportunity.
Do you find, I've been in and out of this conversation with a bunch of people, but like you have a passion around something, and then you bolt it onto a business, and sometimes that, and this is why I think you're alluding to taking these post trips kind of allows you to reset and kind of center. But that is that a balancing act, making sure that your passion doesn't, the business doesn't start ruining your passion?
There's no doubt about it. You can't do too much.
Yeah.
A good friend of mine, Jacques Sirois, who I've known forever, we were both naturalists together with the Wildlife Service out in Saskatchewan. We've kept in touch all these years. He called himself a consultant, but he was unemployed up in Edmonton. And suddenly an opportunity came open for a job position down on a ship in the Antarctic. And so I phoned him up on Friday and I said, Jacques, can you meet me in Buenos Aires on Monday? And he said, but Brian, I am not prepared. And I said, Jacques, all you need is your toothbrush and your binoculars. And so he did. We met, and he spent the next 7 years working with this company as one of their naturalists in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. He just recently retired from it. But Jacques told me when I met up with him on one of these trips to the Antarctic, he said, Brian, you're always so happy. How do you do it? And I said, Jacques, I don't do one trip after the other. After the other. I do one trip, I take 3 months off. Yeah. And then I do another trip somewhere else in the world. Yeah. Then I take 3 months off. And then I do another trip to somewhere else. And he looked at me and he says, yes, but Brian, all these people. And he threw the F word in there too. And it's, so you do have to balance that. Yeah. And because otherwise you can get burnt out for sure. Yeah. But I don't, it's not trip after trip after trip. Yeah. It's to places I really like going to. And, and every time I do these trips, I go to a different part of the landscape. So I'm not going back to the same camps, to the same parks. I try to throw in something new, like the cloud forest in Kenya on this last trip.
The public speaking piece?
Yeah.
Was it a natural thing for you to do? And as I'm sitting here listening to the stories, I'm like, fuck, I want you back, and we just talk stories about the things. But like, you have all these stories in your head, you have all these experiences. Was the speaking this kind of like natural evolution to how you were operating already?
Yeah, for sure. I didn't know it would become the economic opportunity that it's become. So but in those early years, I can't tell you, Jeff, how many presentations I gave for free. Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't just walk into this. Yeah, I honed the ability, and then using the media that I shoot, initially slides. So I'd show slideshows. Now I mix slides with video. And that allows me to wrap the visuals around the story. Yeah. And when I'm giving these presentations, I'm never selling anything. I'm never selling a trip. I tell stories that happen on these trips. Yeah. And then the smart people in the audience will say, I want to be a part of that story. And that's how I seem to somehow keep this momentum going with running these trips to different parts of the world.
Just this like lineup of interesting. Like these people are very interested in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And did you, when you put these pieces all together, and you have this obviously very interesting business right now, speaking, trips and all, does it all make sense to you now that you're in it? You're like, I'm able to do this based on all these experiences, all these years, all this skill set. And right now, do you just feel like you're in this, I don't know, I don't want to say perfect spot, but it just all makes sense?
It's an exciting spot. It definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't go without stress.
Yeah.
So but then, what's life without a little bit of energy stress?
Yeah.
It's like what Bob Sanford said to me, if he would get physically sick before he went and gave presentations. So I think to stay active, to stay sharp, to stay involved, you still need to have that certain amount of stress that keeps you moving. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's a great place to be. But like I said, setting up my tent with my wife beside a babbling creek is just such a wonderful, thing to do. Yeah. So it's the international trips are exciting, but we've got so much in our own backyard here. You don't have to go far, really, to get a charge out of being in our natural world. I mean, we're having more and more trouble finding it, and in our present government situation right now, I feel like we're losing. I can't believe we're still talking about coal. I can't believe that we now have an unlimited opportunity to trap as many wolverines as we want. I can't believe that the provincial park legislation has been rewritten to allow shooting of cougars in Cypress Hills. Jeff, there are times when I wake up in the night and think, what are we doing? We all need to be focused on making sure that we don't let our government allow what we still have in Western Alberta, Western Canada. What we can't let it slip away, and it could easily slip away and become like many of these places in the world that are overpopulated and overdone and overdeveloped and mined and logged and so on. I think we've got to work really hard and focused to make sure we don't lose what still makes us human in Western Canada. I think it's our most valuable asset, intact ecosystems. It keeps us alive. And, our economic systems are fun to play with. And sure, it's nice to make money. But, when I taught at the university, and I taught there for 2 decades, my last class, I would talk about the importance of not letting money rule your life. Yeah, you don't want to be poor. Of course, it's more fun to have money than not. But don't make it your focus in life. Your focus in life is life experience. And life experience isn't necessarily owning that beautiful car. Having a crummy camper on a slide-on pickup truck is kind of a nice way to go.
For sure.
And so, setting objectives to make it so we don't tread ridiculously heavy on this still green landscape. I mean, the world still has intact ecosystems. We're going to have to work awfully hard and awfully smart. We've got 8 billion people on this planet now, and it's having, as you know, a profoundly negative effect. And we gotta stay optimistic, first of all, because if you become pessimistic, you won't get anything done. So we got to remain optimistic, and we got to do what we can do. Jane Goodall says, let's make sure we do it in our backyard, because if we take care of our backyard and everybody's taking care of their backyard, the world's going to be a better place.
Very true. You touched on 2 things. University, for that duration of time, I had no idea. And then the radio show. You said that earlier too. I might have been off camera, but you've been doing this radio show for a long period of time. Yeah. Those 2, how did those 2 fit into your world?
Well, the radio show, it was actually Liz Palmer from CBC. Decades ago. Old people will remember Liz Palmer. But she came to me and said, Brian, we got to do something with you for the summer. Just talk about Canadian wildlife. Talk about your wildlife encounter. Talk about red squirrels. And so I did that for the summer, and that summer became the endless summer. It continues on to this day.
How many years has it been?
I don't know. I think I started in 75.
Wait.
Yeah, and I have cassette tape decks from those, because I used to record them all. So I have cassette tape decks in the bowels of my basement somewhere.
45 years.
Yeah, so there you go. And I don't let CBC know that, so keep this quiet, because they like to recycle people, and if they think I've been around too long, they'll get rid of me. So, and it's, I don't get paid for that gig. It's for fun. And I do it because it helps keep me sharp, and it keeps me on top of things too. And it gives me a voice, with this Wolverine thing. if listeners aren't familiar with this, but our provincial government has just allowed an unlimited trapping opportunity on wolverines. And wolverine experts in this province believe there are less than 1,000, which means, according to the IUCN, they can put them on the endangered species list. And so wolverine technically are near extinction in Alberta. At least they're very, very low in numbers, and we could tip them over very easily. They reproduce slowly. They require huge wilderness landscapes to survive. And trapping is a terrible way of being really successful because they're indiscriminate. They've got an indiscriminate way of killing anything that walks into them. And so they're very efficient is what I'm saying. And there are, according to an article written by Myrna Pierman, who's a naturalist out of Red Deer, she said that there are 1,600 trappers, licensed trap lines in Alberta. There's less than 1,000 wolverine. Now all those trap lines are allowed to trap wolverines. That means we could technically wipe the wolverines out in a few months.
You said staying sharp, both mentally and physically. Is that like top of mind for you, or are you just doing things that are very natural for you to do?
Well, I just love doing these types of things. So, and it gives me a charge to do some research to figure out what I'm going to talk about next week on CBC. So I like doing that. And that's where the sharpness comes in. I think it's important to keep your brain working a little bit. And physically, it's we kind of got out of the habit during COVID. But boy, we would do serious weekends. And we still do good hikes, but not like we were doing pre-COVID. But so we got to get back into that. So physically, I think it's really important to keep on moving. And I guess I came to that conclusion too when I was running these weekend trips up into the mountains. We would take a helicopter to get us up into these alpine lodge locations, and then I would hike with people that often hadn't spent much of their life hiking. And I realized that you got to keep moving.
It's way different.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said at the very, very start of the show. Your deaf sister.
Yeah.
Growing up with a deaf sister, did you learn anything there? And the reason I'm asking is because I've been trying to figure it out with myself.
Yeah.
Growing up with deaf grandparents.
Yeah.
What did I learn? You know what? And for me, it's like, I don't say a lot in social settings. I'm very observant. And I'm trying to piece together what it is that I actually learned being in that environment. Is there anything, do you give it any thought? Have you?
Well, boy, let me tell you, it certainly makes you realize.
Sorry to go all the way back, but I'm
right.
like, this is like a, I've been thinking about it our whole conversation.
Well, it certainly makes me look at the world with a bit more compassion. The troubles my sister has had. I mean, she's had a wonderful life and she's very happy, but it's not gone without some real frustrations. I mean, for a long time there, she was working jobs that were, from my perspective, pretty boring and difficult. Where you'd see very little progress from day to day. So there wasn't that opportunity to get that rush you get from bringing in a guest speaker and filling up the Jubilee Auditorium or any of those kinds of things. And so it's given me a bit of an understanding for the people that have disabilities and that don't have the opportunities we have. We take our opportunities for granted, I believe that seeing is the most valuable thing we have. And yet look at the blind people that are out there. And, obviously they adapt, but what a pleasure it is to look at that, that tanager and see that brilliant color. And we take it for granted, those of us who are blessed with good health. And all of our senses. And hearing, because my mother was an audiologist, I'd go to a Santana conference in high school and she'd test me on the audio on her machinery before I went to the concert. And then the next morning, I'd get home at 3 a.m. The next morning, she would hook me up again and show me where my hearing loss was on the chart. And of course, you do that once or twice, the hearing comes back, but you keep doing it and eventually your hearing gets worse and worse. And so from then on, I started stuffing as much cotton in my ears as I could. And I had long hair in those days, so I could cover my ears. And so my buddies didn't know I had cotton stuff.
Safety first.
Yeah, safety first. And so I would go for coffee after the concert and I'd pull out my cotton without them seeing me do that. And they'd all be yelling at each other and I would be sitting there feeling very, very satisfied because I to be truthful, Jeff, I wanted to hear the birds sing.
Yeah.
And, years ago, I was on one of my first scuba diving trips in the Galapagos Islands and in the late 1980s. And there was two guys that were not that much younger than me. And we couldn't have a conversation around the dinner table because they had listened to rock music all of their years. And they loved it. And that was their passion. But they couldn't hear. Mm-hmm. Which when you're scuba diving, who cares? But when you're having just normal conversation like this, what a tragedy. Yeah. And so I took care of my ears from a very early age. So that's what my sister did for me. Mm-hmm. My sister's disability got my mother involved in becoming a speech therapist. And because of that, she realized the value of hearing, which we all take for granted. Mm-hmm. And so from a very early age, I understood the value of that. Mm-hmm. But no, it's watching my sister get along now. She's so wonderful. She's involved in a dart club, and she's got a boyfriend, long-term boyfriend that she lives with, and he's hard of hearing too. But they're so involved in their community, and it's wonderful. And she skis all the time, and she just got back from a 3-week trip in the United States, and she said she went to a gym every day. So she understands the value of staying fit too, and so good for her. Yeah.
It kind of comes in waves for me when I start thinking about it.
Yeah.
My grandparents just being around it.
Yeah.
And then obviously as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, because there's not many people that you can actually have the conversation with because that experience is very rare.
Yeah, true enough.
Thanks for doing this.
Jeff, it's a pleasure.
It's, I've heard your name for so long.
Oh, thanks.
And the interesting thing is I don't do any research on the guests.
Ah, interesting.
So I know the name.
Yeah.
So I know like kind of the world you play. Yeah. But that's it. I don't know the story behind it all. So to sit across from you.
Yeah.
Well, listen to you do it. It's like.
Well, thanks for not asking me what my favorite animal is, or what have you been nearly killed, or all those things that often people do ask. So, what a pleasure.
Which is interesting, right? Because characters like you that have been, interviewed, showcased, whatever, and for a long amount of time. That's it, right? There's like this Wikipedia of accomplishments or things, right? And that's why I don't do any research because who we are is not that list. Yeah. So that's kind of my hack to actually making these things somewhat interesting
It's a cool hack.
Well, and it's, thank you. But, you've been interviewed by everybody, right? You've been on how many shows, blah, blah, blah. So to actually, I want something different, right? I want to actually know who the person is versus the accomplishments.
Well, thanks, Jeff.
I end the show with one question.
Okay.
When I say Calgary, where's your head go?
Clear water, river. I've been to a lot of cities and a lot of places around the world, and they're usually muddy and polluted. We're lucky. We have a ribbon of beauty going through this river or through this city. And, we're going to have to take care of that. But the riparian areas around the river, biking along the pathways and hearing, all the different bird species in the spring calling away, it makes my heart sing.
Amazing. I feel that when I ride around the reservoir in the mornings.
Yeah. Very good.
Sun comes up. I kind of go north Weaselhead and around, and I just, the sounds. And just
what a pleasure.
Yeah, we're lucky.
Yeah.
Thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, you bet, Jeff.